It's a pleasure to be with you, even if virtually. Today I'm going to be talking about a project that we did a couple of years ago now, looking at a GIS analysis of the early medieval Hillfort of Dinas Powys. So the occupation and reoccupation of Hillforts is very much a defining feature of the archaeology of post-Roman Western and Northern Britain. And this is quite, and indeed much of Europe as well. And this is quite a distinctive phenomena, which appears to be comparatively short-lived, focusing on the 5th, 6th and sort of first half of the 7th centuries AD. Now, these sites have been known about for some time. There's been quite a lot of research, particularly focused on imported pottery and glass, which is a kind of a key characteristic of these sites. And there was quite a lot of excavation on a number of sites in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, including key excavations at Dinas Powys and sites such as South Canterbury and Canterbury Castle. And it's fair to say we know quite a bit about the activity at these sites and what is going on, but we know quite a lot less about their landscape context and how these post-Roman sites sit within their contemporary landscapes. And this is a sort of notable contrast to research which has been done on Iron Age Hillforts. We don't really have many projects that are comparable to the Danebury Environs project, which was led by Barry Cunliffe in the 1980s. The reason for this, I think, is in large part due to the fact that the sort of traditional techniques of landscape archaeology, things like field walking and aerial photography and sort of test pit work, are not well suited to the post-Roman period in Western Britain, where we have few recognisable and defined site types, very little widespread material culture. And it's for this reason that, despite some quite brave attempts, including John Davies' work on the environs of South Canterbury, and some interesting work on sites such as Denad in Scotland by Ewan Campbell and Alan Lane, our understanding of the post-Roman Hillfort phenomenon is very much site-focused. So one of the things we were trying to do in this project was to provide a broader landscape context for a post-Roman Hillfort. And one of the, or a range of techniques have been developed in recent years, which can help us to do this and can help us to overcome some of the problems associated with sort of traditional approaches to landscape archaeology. And that's the potential of GIS analysis. And a number of recent projects have demonstrated how fairly advanced forms of GIS analysis can be used to help us situate early medieval power centres and significant sites within their local and regional landscapes. And a lot of this work is focused on 3D visualization and integrated analysis of patterns of movement through landscapes, using things like least cost paths, and also integrating that analysis with visibility, using things like view sheds. And various projects such as work on the Pillar River Liseg by Howard Williams and colleagues, and work on Yevrin, the important Anglo-Saxon and potentially British Power Centre in northern England, and also work on Hillforts in Spain, has demonstrated that these forms of GIS analysis can help us understand how these sites sat within their landscapes and related to topography and potentially contemporary settlement patterns. But there are considerable methodological challenges in using these forms of analysis. They are very much based, viewsheds and movement least cost paths very much are based on modern data sets, and in particular modern topographic data. And they are not very sensitive to changes in landscape since the early medieval period. And most research has largely sort of used terrain as the main factor in these data sets. There's been less consideration of the impact of rivers and what they may impact on the early medieval landscape, and also land use, patterns of land use as well. And the problem with GIS analysis is it's very good and comparatively easy to do, but there is a danger in using modern data sets, modern topographic data sets, which aren't sensitive to things to changes in the landscape, and aren't sensitive to the nature of the early medieval landscape. We may be deriving or undertaking our analysis on data sets which are simply not appropriate. So the aim of this project, which was generously funded by the Cambrian Archaeological Association, was to try to create data sets and establish a methodology which could be used for a GIS-enabled analysis of an early medieval or post-Roman hill fort. And we focused this work on perhaps the most well-known of all these sites, which is Dinas Powys. And this was a sort of fairly small project, as I said, funded by the Cambrians, which we did over a sort of a 4-week period, an intensive 4-week period, back in 2018. And our objectives in this project were firstly to create a digital terrain model, so a sort of map of the surface which had the modern landscape changes or the post-medieval landscape changes removed. We then wanted to create a cost surface, which is what we use for doing things like least cost path analysis, that was more sensitive to the impacts of land cover and impediments to movement that would have existed in the early medieval period, such as rivers. We also wanted to define a network of movement across the environs of Dinas Powys. And to do this, we needed to define entry and exit nodes that could be used in least cost path analysis that were again appropriate to the early medieval period. And then what we wanted to do was to integrate these data sets and use them to perform analysis of viewsheds and least cost paths, which may be able to tell us something about the landscape context of our site. So before I go into our analysis, I'll just quickly introduce the site. Dinas Powys, inland multi-vallet hill fort in the eastern Vale of Glamorgan, excavated by Leslie Alcock in the 1950s, but there's been some subsequent work largely focused on reanalysis of Alcock's material. And this includes recent radiocarbon dating, and we now have quite a precise chronology for this site, which is very much late 5th to middle of the 7th centuries. And it is, by some stretch, one of the most impressive and richest post-Roman hill forts we know from Wales and Western Britain. It's a small site, only 0.1 of a hectare, but with very substantial defences, 4 sets of banks and ditches, and Alcock recovered a very impressive artefact assemblage, which I'm sure many of you will know from his sort of definitive publication. Big assemblage of import ware, evidence for metalworking, lots of evidence for tools and implements, bone combs that we've got here. And this is a very rich site, and clearly a site of some status and some significance within the landscape. Most likely a site that was occupied, at least periodically, by a local ruler. But there has been quite a bit of debate over the years as to the sort of location of Dinas Powys, and whether it was a remote site, sort of a squalid and inconvenient eyrie, kind of set away and apart and remote, or something which was more integrated into its medieval landscape. So we thought this would be a good case study to focus this analysis on. So our first step was to build a digital terrain model. And our basis for this was the modern 2-meter LiDAR data, the best, highest resolution that we had of comprehensive coverage for. And then we undertook retrogressive landscape analysis using historic maps. And this allowed us to identify post-medieval changes in landscape, roads, railway lines, quarries, things that may impact upon the outcomes of a least cost path analysis, and remove those and correct them in the digital terrain model. We then needed to derive a cost surface, and we did this using analysis of slope and ruggedness derived from our digital terrain model. But we were also able to integrate land use data deriving from pollen analysis and historic landscape characterization, and we factored in rivers as well, and we determined some criteria for when rivers were an impediment to movement or not. And on the basis of that, we were able to come up with at least a cost surface which we feel was more appropriate to the use of the early medieval landscape. The next thing we needed to do was try to define entry and exit nodes, which could be used for the GIS to calculate the least cost paths between. And we did this by defining historic landing points on the south coast, by defining important river crossings on major rivers to the east and west, and defining ancient trackways heading into the Glamorgan uplands, which we know appear to have been in use in the early medieval period. And these seem to be the nodes by which people were entering and exiting the study area surrounding Dinas Powys. So then it was simply a matter of getting the GIS to connect the dots on the basis of the least cost path that we had defined. So what does this data, what did this analysis tell us? Well, it tells us that Dinas Powys was situated in quite a particular location. It sits at the confluence of 2 sets of routeways leading from landing places on the coast, and the viewshed analysis demonstrated that the site was able to sort of visually command those routeways through the landscape, and it could see at least 15 kilometres of these routeways. And we were able to determine as well that woodland, as far as our historic landscape characterization allowed us to reconstruct woodland, suggests that this was unlikely to have had a major impact on our results. So the site does seem to be located in relation to patterns of movement. We were also able to determine that for anyone moving along the routeways within the environs of the site, Dinas Powys would have been a very visually prominent landmark. You would have been seen walking through this landscape, and you would have seen the site walking through this landscape. Dinas Powys also had view sheds and visibility to sites further afield, contemporary sites further afield, including Hillforts at Cadbury Castle, Cadbury Congresbury, Cannington and Brent Knoll. And I think these hint at sort of wider connections between elite sites in this post-Roman period. We were also able to use this analysis to get a firm understanding of the topographic position of Dinas Powys. And we were able to tell that it is located in the first readily defensible position, adjacent to the coast. There are more defensive locations in the vicinity, but those locations are more remote from the lowland routeways, whereas Dinas Powys is close to the lowland routeways, but defensive and very visually prominent. And I think that's an important factor in our understanding of this site. So where does this kind of lead us? Well, I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with models and abstractions, but the siting of Dinas Powys within its landscape appears to have been determined by a balance between defensive capabilities, visual prominence, proximity to coastal landing places, overland routeways, and good quality agricultural land. And its siting would have enhanced its monumentality, would have facilitated surveillance and control over trade and the collection of render and movement of the elite household between centres. And it's perhaps we can suggest that Dinas Powys was a gatekeeper settlement, overseeing and monitoring movement from landing places on the coast. But as you'll see from the figures we've produced, Dinas Powys only controls a corner of its environs, and it appears to sit within a proto-kingdom focused on the eastern Vale of Glamorgan. So it's unlikely to have been the centre of the proto-kingdom. It focuses very much on a corner in the eastern Vale of Glamorgan, and it was perhaps part of a network of contemporary sites. And our analysis suggested that we may be able to identify one or two of those contemporary sites. The Hillfort at Llanfyllin, close to Llancarvan, is very similar to Dinas Powys in its setting and in its relationship to view sheds and least cost paths, and also is a small inland multi-valid promontory fort. It's not excavated, but I think this is a strong candidate for a contemporary site to Dinas Powys. So I think in this short talk we've hopefully been able to demonstrate that GIS has great potential for enhancing our understanding of post-Roman hill forts. But what we need are good data sets to work from, and we need to define appropriate parameters for analysis. And I hope we've presented a methodology here which is one way of achieving that. I hope we've shown that Dinas Powys was not a squalid and inconvenient area or a nest of robbers, that it was a locus of elite activity that was strategically positioned within its landscape to control movement along natural routeways, and that it was probably one of a network of sites in the region. So perhaps we should see these hill forts as something like a sort of apparatus of governance at this time. They performed a very important role. Okay, just before signing off, I'd just like to thank Leo Secarina-Thomas, who is the research assistant on this project, also the Cambrian Archaeological Association, who provided funding, as well as Tudor Davis, Alan Lane, Tim Young, Ewan Campbell, Rian Comu, Gordon Noble and James Gerard. And if you'd like to read more about this work, we have a paper published in the European Journal of Archaeology. And if you don't have access to this, feel free to email me and I will send you a copy. Thank you very much.